Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I coordinate the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module Standpoint Theory. In this module, we will look into the history and development in terms of the standpoint theory. We will also understand it, especially in terms of feminist standpoint theory, and also look into the basic concepts. In this module, we will also explore the background, especially in terms of the emergence of gender, sexuality studies, and how it emerged and how that has an impact on the way standpoint theory has been constructed. At the end, it will also deal into issues of epistemology, methodology, theory, and what does it mean. The objective of this module is to introduce the idea of standpoint theory, its history, theoretical trajectory, and basic concepts. Throughout the chapter, you will also find questions raised that will act as mental exercises for you to aid understanding and application of the theory. Standpoint theory represents the feminist response to and reworking of Marxian ideas of historical materialism and class consciousness. It recognizes that knowledge has a socio-economic base and should not be disassociated from its historical context. Knowledge, this theory argues, is political, social, and community based, and that scholarly curiosity, research, and exploration are rarely ever neutral and innocent. Consider this: if science, medicine, and pharmacy are benevolent social sciences concerned with control and eradication of diseases and with health and well-being of all, why are human beings in the third world uses guinea pigs for drug trials? Why were phrenology and social biology considered sciences when the chief objectives seem to be gathering evidence about the physical, intellectual, and ethical inferiority of non-white races and women? Why is Ada Lovelace, the mother of the scientific computing, not a household name but Thomas Edison is? Edison is famous as much for his inventions as he is for his unethical business practices. Why we never hear about women artists and authors of the Renaissance? In India, why do many uncritically accept the colonial categories of scheduled tribes and sexual acts against the order of nature? Who decides what nature is, or what is natural? Who studies it? If you have ever taken a step back in the process of mastering a knowledge or a skill such as mathematics, literature, sociology, or computer programming and wondered about the masters of that knowledge, visible and famous scholars and researchers that wrote canonical texts or credited with creating a field of study, you might have wondered about standpoints. Chances are you were asking yourself some questions. Standpoint theory asks as well without knowing about this theoretical tradition. To expand your knowledge about this theory, let us start by understanding its own history and context. Section 1. History, development, and some major theoreticians. Standpoint theory was developed during and after the civil rights, feminist, and other self-determination and anti-establishment movements of the 1970s United States. These movements pushed, among other things, to acknowledge the relationship of knowledge, power, and experience. Standpoint theory was developed in recognition of how identity shapes knowledge. Normative analysis of knowledge and the study of knowledge production involve taking a step back from the content of knowledge to examine its context, norms, and practices, and interrogating the basis of justification of knowledge claims. The study of knowledge production is named as epistemology, which is essentially a philosophy of knowledge. Standpoint theory started to come on its own with the writings of authors who challenged the androcentric, Eurocentric, and heterosexist notion of what knowledge is and what is normal. In Western epistemology, there is a pivotal understanding that it is possible to provide a universal, objective, and abstract account of knowledge and scientific inquiry. This epistemology does not recognize the socially situated nature of knowledge and science. It pretends that scientists are unbiased, unprejudiced, and detached from any social or political context, that they are knowledgeable, hardworking individuals trying to discover, invent, solve problems, and answer questions about what is. For conventional epistemology, epistemic sovereignty rests in the figure of the modern scientist, the empiricist, the positivist, realist, objectivist, Western male who produces scientific knowledge, the highest form of knowledge in a hierarchical system of scholarly production. The content of this science may be re-examined, modified, and built upon over time, but the nature of science remains indefensible and the scientific method infallible. Conventional epistemology raises many questions. What is knowledge? What is justification? What are the necessary, sufficient and ideal conditions of knowledge production? What makes knowledge consistent, reliable and valid? Thus, it is normative and analytical project. The answer to the aforementioned questions often point out at a subject. Here we mean subject as a conscious actor. Embodied, here we mean a subject as a conscious actor embedded in a symbolic systems of knowledge and language, not subject of grammar or your favorite subject in school, that is neutral, normal, standards recognized. This subject is part of the European Renaissance germinated modernity, unified and autonomous. In the words of Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, this subject is narrativized by the law, political economy and ideology of the West, and this concealed subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations. She calls this subject concealed because nobody raises questions about his geopolitical motivations and affects his colonizing tendencies or his mythology. This subject is concealed because his culture and history are recognized by all, so apparently do not merit further discussion. In any case, because the knowledge this subject produces is considered as universal and objective, the social context of production as well as social location is understood as irrelevant. Even authors who question the meaning, nature and source of knowledge, such as Foucault with his archaeology of knowledge, do not reflect back and question their own subjectivity and authority. From the perspective of standpoint theory, this reflection is very important. Foucault believes that the history of thought, of knowledge, of philosophy, of literature seems to be seeking and discovering more and more discontinuities, whereas history itself appears to be abandoning the eruption of events in favor of stable structures. Conventional epistemology too tends towards stable structures. Let us go back to the aforementioned questions raised by conventional epistemology about justification and objectivity. These are important questions. However, note how this epistemology does not seem to question the meaning of what is objective, what is real, and for whom. Conventional philosophers of knowledge do not seem to be fazed by the idea that knowledge creators seem to always be Western males. They are interested in the source of knowledge, but not so much by the effects. Even in investigating the source, they follow a certain logocentric assumption, the primacy of written words and speech and language, without asking why some languages are primarily considered as languages of knowledge and scholarship. What about the social groups that have no access, no intellectual capital, no say in the knowledge production that directly affects their lives? What about the social context of knowledge? What about empirically tested fact that knowledge production is often a result of collaboration between many people? Enter social epistemology. This form of epistemology relies on social model of knowers rather than an individual unified subject model. It questions why science is the focus of epistemology or the scientific method is the choicest method of knowledge production. Feminist philosophers of science and epistemology, feminist scientists and political scientists, and feminist scholars from varied fields such as sociology and economics have questioned, confronted, and recreated epistemology so that it embodies transparency, honesty, and social justice. Feminist standpoint theory is the result of this radical reconfiguration of what knowledge is and also what it can be. The idea is to minimize harm and to maximize social justice. Social epistemology is more inclusive, embodying a recognition of oppression, including epistemic oppression of hitherto marginalized social groups whose contributions to knowledge are unrecognized and who have often been barred from knowledge production, often used as objects of study. Who are these social groups? Do they still exist in India, in the world? Who comes to mind? Whose standpoints are recognized and whose aren't? While you ponder on these questions, let us turn the discussion to Karl Marx, who you have likely to have studied in your classical sociological traditions course. Remember how Marx roots social reality in production relations, theorizes about material economic base, structure of society, and bourgeois proletariat divide. Marx argues that modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master to the great factory of industrialist capitalists. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism claims gain to be its end and aim, and therefore petty, the more hateful and more embittering it is. The social position of the proletariat radically influences its knowledge of the world and itself. Proletariat, the working class, views capitalism from the standpoints of its operation and attempts to organize on the basis of this shared consciousness, this shared subjectivity of class struggle. Thus, class consciousness is a unique standpoint. Marx's theory of class consciousness differentiates between class for itself and class for itself. Nancy Hartstock, a feminist philosopher, derived some important lessons from standpoint from Marx's discussion of the same. She delineates that material life of laborers structures her understanding of reality, which is a kind of a dialectic epistemology, an interactive unity between self and the other, social and natural, mind and body. The bourgeois controls not just the means of materials production but also cultural and epistemic production. Within the proletariat standpoint and class consciousness lies inherent the possibility of a classless society. Hartstock took these arguments further to critique androcentric and phallocentric ideologies and institutions and acute critique of the capitalist heteropatriarchy. Hartstock calls this critique a feminist standpoint. Hartstock's work is among the pioneering feminist critiques of Marxism. Note that critique does not mean rejection but rereading and radical revisioning. Critique that points out that Marxist ideology understands laborers as naturally male and while discussing patriarchy does not forward a strong critique of it. Hartstock discusses women's work in terms of the sexual division of labor as well as dual labor of contribution to subsistence and childbearing. Women's reproductive labor is very different from the labor of the male workers, and this points at the possibility of unique standpoint. Thus, the male worker in the process of production is involved in contact with necessity and interchange with the nature as well as other human beings, but the process of production of work does not consume his whole life. The activity of a woman in the home as well as the work she does for wages keeps her continually in contact with the world of qualities and change. Her immersion in the world of use in concrete, many qualified changing material processes is more complete than his. And if a life itself consists of sensuous activity, the vantage point available to women on the basis of their contribution to subsistence represents an intensification and deepening of the materialist worldview and consciousness available to the producers of commodities in capitalism, an intensification of class consciousness. This is a radical revisioning of what a class consciousness can be. An application of this unique standpoint could be in the way Canadian sociologist Dorothy Smith argued that women sociologists have a different and valuable standpoint, one which is ignored within the discipline. This is because the profession of sociology is predicated on a universe which is occupied by men and is still itself largely appropriated by men as a territory. Sociology is part of the practice by which we are all governed, and that practice establishes its relevance. The institutions which lock sociology into the structures occupied by men are the same institutions which lock women into situations in which they find themselves oppressed. She is thus arguing that sociology could study a patriarchal society while operating within that patriarchy. That the way the profession is organized is not much different from the way any scholarly profession is organized, and indeed the way labor market is organized. It follows a certain male logic and privileges the male viewpoint and work. The way sociologists understand capitalism or patriarchy is largely determined by the gender and class. Dorothy Smith wrote this article in 1974. How much has sociology changed since then? Or has it? How does gender, class, geopolitical location influence sociological and indeed all knowledge production? And what do you think? Race is an important factor in understanding the world as well as researching and writing about it. Patricia Hill Collins, in her book Black Feminist Thought, argues that black women as agents of knowledge or epistemic agents hold a unique standpoint. This standpoint, she says, is unique given the theory of African Americans in the United States. This standpoint, she says, is often the one that is silenced by philosophers, sociologists, and policy makers. Black feminist thought is a specialized knowledge created by African American women which clarifies the standpoint of and for black women. Black women's consciousness is created using an alternative ways of producing and validating knowledge. This knowledge put forth new versions of truth and aid in principal coalition building within a community silenced and marginalized by the very social institution, academia included. Race has been central to not just how social theory is developed and organized, but how the social sciences operate. Remember how the study of science was a central project in conventional epistemology. The emergence of feminist standpoint theory and feminist science studies created theories of social epistemology, and revealed how scientific knowledge under the guise of objective neutrality has often been racist and sexist. But again, this critique of science from a feminist standpoint is not a call to do away with sciences, but to hold it responsible and hold it to its own objective standards. Here, the notion of strong objectivity is something we explore in our next section on feminist standpoint theory. Section 2, Feminist Social Epistemology and Standpoint Theory. As you may have realized, feminist philosophers have made significant contributions towards the development of not just social epistemology but also standpoint theory. Social epistemology is a study of social and political dimensions of knowledge or information, a field that gained currency with the development of sociology of knowledge and critical theory. Feminist epistemology, including standpoint theory, was a political mission that aimed to include women in the traditional epistemological project, emerged a sophisticated critique of the traditional epistemological project, a critique that deconstructed and reconfigured scientific knowledge, reason, and authority. Feminist epistemology recognizes the myth of value-free, detached, universalistic, apolitical, gender neutral knowledge. Feminism often embodies uneasy tensions between institutionalization and radical liberation, accommodation and rejection, tradition and modernity, discipline and interdiscipline, politics of alliance and politics of difference, and activism and academia. Feminist epistemology too has to negotiate between appropriation and rejection of traditional epistemology, abstraction and groundedness, materiality, and a whole gamut of binaries instituted by a male-centric modernity. It has to negotiate questions such as, does epistemology address concrete concerns? Is woman or women a single referent? What happens when knowledge makers become their own subjects? Should feminist epistemology limit itself to gender issues? Feminist philosophy of science incorporated post-colonial and subaltern standpoints, using intersectionality as a lens of inquiry, and further claimed that modernity and sciences that made modernity possible were decidedly masculinist, misogynist, which failed to include and integrate the women and the colonized as legitimate stakeholders in civilization, or sometimes even as human. Scholars such as Annie Foster Sterling, Londa Schleibinger, Lynn Hankinson-Lenson, Sandra Harding, Donna Haraway suggest that colonial knowledge systems of statistics, biology, conservation, medicine, and anthropology effectively created and sustained subject position. This systematic marginalization and erasure have generated multiple feminist and post-colonial sites of protest and resistance. For example, Vandana Shiva identifies women's seed-keeping and ecofeminism as such a site that upholds traditional knowledge systems where women have been the producers and carriers of such knowledge. Within feminist philosophy of science, Sandra Harding and Donna Haraway deserve special mention. Harding approached the issue of standpoint from the perspective of feminist science studies and future research methodology. Like many feminist scholars, Harding wanted to preserve a critical Marxian theoretical legacy that can be reinterpreted to make sense of gender and intersectional social relationships. In 1983, Sandra Harding, along with Meryl Hintica, published a collection of critical essays on standpoint theory. This anthology was titled as Discovering Reality, Feminist Perspective on Epistemology, Metaphysics, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science, and it established a tradition of feminist standpoint theory by bringing in scholars from feminist science studies, feminist and social epistemology, as well as researchers from sociology and other social science. Thus, a new epistemology is needed because old epistemology does not raise questions or offers answers about the absence and invisibility of women as knowledge producers and powerlessness and lack of agencies of women as objects of knowledge. We are not just talking about living women who were used and described by scientists such as Freud and Darwin to prove their theories, but also dead women, literally whose bodies were used to create a whole field of forensic science. The practices of sociobiology, phrenology, scientific racism, and eugenics validated and furthered racial and gender discrimination. Women's practices of knowledge production that have helped communities historically understand nature, agriculture, health, and healing were sidetracked, devalued, and categorized as witchcraft, unscientific, feminine intuition. Donna Haraway is a trained biologist and a feminist theorist who studies the fields of primatology, museum studies, and natural sciences to provide critical accounts of how imperialist, racist, and sometimes misogynist these fields are. Looking into conceptual practices of taxidermy, diorama's in museums, she shows how these projects were organized to provide evidence of the superiority of whites over other races and men or women. In Haraway's study by patriarchy, taxidermy in the Garden of Eden, New York City, 1908 to 1936, she presents a study of African Hall in the American Museum of Natural History in the New York City. She historicizes the taxidermy of the museum and its dioramas, focusing on the taxidermist Carl Ackley, who is indeed the representative of the great white father, the white hunter in the heart of Africa. She reads the museum as a creator, preserver, promulgator of the knowledge of sciences and natural history through conservation, exhibition, and eugenics. In exposing the elitist, racist, and sexist creation and contribution of knowledge, Haraway's work embodies a strong feminist degeneration of a science in a different social womb that has historically propped up capitalist patriarchy, racism, and varied forms of social control and subjugation of the other. Haraway calls the notion of the objective, complete, technologically sophisticated science a god trick that operates on the basis of binaries yet fails to account for oppositions for alternative and native local knowledges. Yet most knowledge is indeed gathered from a partial contextual perspective, not from the kind of all-knowing infinite vision that scientific knowledge claims. For Haraway, the logic of the standpoint is a way to conceptualize situated knowledge that embraces politics and epistemologies of location, positioning, and situating, where partiality and not universality is a condition of being heard. Science and conventional epistemology excommunicates all values that emanate from situatedness, politics, epistemological community, and coalition, subjective interpretation of data, to name a few, for the purpose of its own invulnerability and perpetual validation. Yet without studying standpoint theory, you probably know that knowledge, including scientific knowledge, is political. Next section will expand this idea. Section 3, Basic Concepts. At this stage, we delineate certain basic concepts of point theory. Strong objectivity. Objectivity is a knowledge claim that denotes that the knowledge under consideration is true, reliable, and proven, and that there are supporting evidence for the claims made, and that empirical inquiry has been conducted to gather this knowledge. We often colloquially or philosophically discuss objective facts from reality or positions. Science is also considered by many philosophers to be the highest form of objective knowledge. Sandra Harding points out that the sciences often incorporate weak objectivity. The scientific enterprise's endless quest to exploit nature and extract resources without caring for long-term effects, its exclusion of women and people of color directly or indirectly due to deep-seated socio-biological beliefs about the intellectual inferiority of these groups, its unethical use of research subjects, its imprecise arrogance of not investigating its own methods, shows that this enterprise might not practice the same objectivity that it claims. Harding therefore argues for a stronger and embodied objectivity. In fact, standpoint theory's principal epistemic claim seems to be its incorporation of a strong objectivity, and that acknowledgement of social situatedness allows for greater objectivity. Conventional sciences and philosophy of science, in their endless arrogance, have claimed to understand everything about the world, accounts that feminist scholarship have exposed to be one-sided, misogynist, completely ignoring the perspectives, experiences, and subjectivity of women and other marginalized social groups. Standpoint theory does not lay claim on value-free objectivity, neither does it embrace judgmental cultural relativism. It strengthens the standards of objectivity by making it reflexive, requiring casual analysis, and not just the micro processes in the laboratory but also the macro tendencies in the social world which shape scientific practices. It acknowledges the historicity and politics of knowledge creation, making knowledge contextual, impartial, and inclusive. The standpoint theory requires the agent to be put in the same critical causal plane of the objects of inquiry. Standpoint theory opens the way to stronger standards of both objectivity and reflexivity. These standards require that research projects use their historical location as a resource for obtaining greater objectivity. Social location. Recognition of social location of knowers and agents of knowledge is a central concept in standpoint theory. Harding states that conventional objectivism aimed at value-free research turns away from the task of critically identifying broad historical social desires, interests, and values that shapes the agendas, contents, and results of the sciences as much as they shape the rest of the human affairs. She names reflexivity as a source for strong objectivity, and she also differentiates between subject of conventional knowledge and subjects for feminist standpoint inquiry. The latter subjects are embodied and visible, are not fundamentally different from objects of knowledge, produce communal, cultural and not detached individual knowledge, are multiple, heterogeneous and contradictory, incoherent as opposed to unitary, homogeneous and coherent empirical epistemological subjects. The social location of knowledge makers and the relationships with others heavily impact and constitute their intellectual production. Sometimes an outsider within status, within a system or structure can yield rich and specialized knowledge rather than insider status. A careful review of emerging black feminist literature reveals that many black intellectuals, especially those in touch with the marginality in academic settings, tap this standpoint in producing distinctive analysis of race, class and gender. Communities as knowers. Within standpoint theory as well as feminist social epistemology, the notion of communities as knowers and epistemic communities is a crucial focus, which is very different from individualistic techno-scientific idea of a few scholars working in isolation and creating knowledge from a theoretical and experimental methods. One has probably heard about Thomas Edison's quote on genius being 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. Given Edison's widely known unethical business practices relating to his own and others' invention, we should probably reread the meaning of this quote. Whose perspiration many scientists and inventors could not have achieved what they are most visible for without help from a lot of other collaborators inside and outside the laboratories. But they have rarely mentioned these collaborators, especially female collaborators, while being recognized and honored. The idea of path-breaking individual contributions and individual genius is therefore historically suspect. Having epistemic privilege or the ability to be heard and be visible for one's work is rarely, if ever, just a function of one's unusual genius. Feminist standpoint theorists understand the process of knowledge production as collective and community-based. They tie the idea of epistemic privilege to epistemic communities. Feminist theories such as Lenson and Elizabeth Potter endorse the view of communities as knowledge producers. Communities are the primary generators, repositories, holders, and acquirers of knowledge. Knowledge can only be validated or legitimized in the context and standards of systems adopted by a community as right. In revealing the communal, historical and the contingent nature of knowledge, standpoint epistemology analyzes the process of micro-negotiations that give rise to epistemic decisions on physical and social sciences. Helen Longino also discusses the social nature of knowledge production, and she makes a case for socially constituted objectivity. How can this be achieved? Longino makes the following suggestions. Publicly recognized forums for criticisms of evidence, methods, assumptions and reasoning. Dissent and critique are not merely elements to be tolerated but should be resources for critical transformation. There must be publicly recognized standards by reference to which theories, hypotheses, observational practices are evaluated. These standards may vary across communities. Epistemic communities must be authorized by equality of intellectual authority. Consensus must be the result of a critical dialogue and deliberations and not the result of exercise of political or economic power. Notice that this community of knowers recognizes the situated nature of knowledge and opts for an explanation of knowledge production that is strongly objective. An individual opinion may be subjective and may not be considered as knowledgeable, but speaking about a community's experiential knowledge, which is relational process featuring checks and balances, points at the possibility of a democratic and complex production. In this module on standpoint theory, we have looked into the history, intellectual background, and the purpose of doing work based within the framework of standpoint theory. Further, the discussions in this module would also help us to apply it in understanding our own work as well as students' work as well as others' intellectual work. Further, because this module has drawn on philosophy of sciences, especially in terms of community as knowers, one's own social location, and discuss the ideas in terms of strong objectivity, it gives us important methodological and theoretical vantage points to understand how do we work out standpoint theory in our own work and life. Thank you.